Part 37. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiaorong. Chapter 362. Liaozhou, at the City Gate. This chapter was first published on AI.U. Shen, Novel Network. Please remember the URL. Tang Ning rode on the horse, waved to the Liaozhou governor, and said, "Everyone, just send them here." After staying in Liaozhou for a day, it was time to set off. The governor of Liaozhou cupped his hand and said, "Your Highness, the princess, has a safe journey. On the way back, I will have a drink with Mr. Tang again." Tang Ning waved her hand, "Goodbye." The hospitality of the local officials of Chu State is worthy of praise. I wonder if the state capitals encountered further ahead are the same as Liaozhou. Although she only stayed in Liaozhou for one day, Tang Ning still discovered some unusual places through yesterday's cleansing banquet. Taking Liaozhou as an example, the local officials in Liaozhou city have extremely strong cohesion. The restraints imposed by the Liaozhou governor on other officials are not just the restraint of superiors on subordinates. They show a kind of persuasiveness towards the Liaozhou governor. Tang Ning passed through many state capitals along the way, but none of them gave him such a feeling. At the city gate, Liaozhou officials watched the convoy go away. When there was only a black line left in front, an official took 2 steps forward, looked at the Liaozhou governor, and said, "Sir, after 2 hours, we won't have any chance." The governor of Liaozhou withdrew his gaze from a distance and said, "Take care of yourself and don't make decisions for the prince." "Yes," the official responded, took 2 steps back and remained silent. On the other side, Liaozhou Simo laughed heartily twice and said, "It is not us who make the decision for the prince, but the prince. The current situation is not controlled by anyone, just wait and see." Tang Ning leaned on the carriage and looked at the white clouds that had gathered in the sky like mountain peaks. She watched the white clouds gather and disperse. She was actually so bored most of the time along the way. At this time, it had been 2 days since they left Liaozhou. From Liaozhou, according to their speed, it would take about 4 or 5 days to reach the next state city. Staying in those smaller county towns is actually not much different from camping on the same spot. Her ears have become much clearer in the past 2 days. Since losing to him that morning, Wang Yanyan has not said a word to him. Apart from that, she had never resisted the meals delivered to her. She just sat alone in the carriage, not knowing what she was thinking. Tang Ning looked at the sun above her head, walked to the front, and asked Lu Tang, "How long until the next state city?" Lu Tang rode on the horse, looked ahead, and said, "If everything goes well, we should arrive at noon tomorrow." It looked like we would have to camp in the wild for the night. Tang Ning looked at the sky and said, "Let everyone stop and have something to eat before leaving." They only started cooking after setting up camp in the evening. During the day, they mainly ate dry food. Tang Ning was nibbling on a cold bun when a palace maid suddenly ran over from behind and said, "Master Tang, it's not good, that girl sick." Tang Ning finished the buns in 2 or 3 bites, jumped off the carriage, frowned and said, "Why are you sick? Is it serious?" The palace maid shook her head and said, "I don't know. Master Tang, I'd better go and see for yourself." As Tang Ning walked towards the back, she ordered, "Go and ask Dr. Wang to come over." Wang Yanyan's illness was more serious than he thought. Her forehead was extremely hot and she was lying listlessly in the carriage, seemingly unconscious. Dr. Wang withdrew his fingers from her wrist and said, "We haven't found the cause of this girl's illness yet. Maybe it's because the journey was too bumpy and tiring. Let her rest for a day and she might be fine." She didn't seem to be infected with cold, nor did she have any other obvious illness. She was said to be from bumps and fatigue, but for a martial arts practitioner like her, even if her martial arts skills were mediocre, her physical fitness was far superior to that of ordinary people. Even Zhao Man's palace maid everything was fine, how could she fall ill first? Since the cause of the disease was not found, Dr. Wang did not dare to use medicine indiscriminately. Tang Ning thought that she would be fine after a night's rest, so she deliberately moved the camp time forward by an hour. But early the next morning, not only was her illness not cured, she was completely unconscious. She was lying on the bed, mumbling words that Tang Ning couldn't understand. Tang Ning rubbed her eyebrows. If she had a problem here, things would be in trouble. Lu Ten walked in from outside and said, "Master Tang, it's time for us to set off." Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "Just rest for half a day and enter the city before dark." Lu Ten was startled when he heard this. He didn't know why he suddenly wanted to rest for a long time, but he still nodded and said, "Okay." Tang Ning walked to Butcher Zheng's tent and said, "Old Zheng, lend me a jar of your wine." Butcher Zheng was not as stingy as the old beggar. He waved his hand and said, "Take it." Tang Ning took a jar of wine, heated it in the water bath for a while, then called a palace maid, dipped a cloth in the wine, wiped Wan Yanyan's forehead and palms, and said, "Take off her clothes and wipe them like this her body." She had a serious fever now. If she didn't cool down quickly, she might hurt her head. After Tang Ning told the palace maid about the key points of using alcohol to cool down, she withdrew from the account. A quarter of an hour later, the palace maid came out and said, "Sir, the girl is awake and wants to see you." Tang Ning took a look inside and asked, "Has she put on clothes?" The palace maid said, "Put it on." Tang Ning walked into the tent and saw Wan Yanyan lying on the bed, looking straight at the top of the tent. She didn't know if it was because her body temperature had dropped, but she seemed to be in better spirits. She looked at Tang Ning and said, "I figured it out." Tang Ning stood beside the bed and asked, "What have you figured out?" She looked at Tang Ning and said, "You are not wrong, and I am not wrong either." Unexpectedly, she had a fever. Not only was she no longer confused, but her thinking became clearer. Tang Ning looked at her and said, "You should rest for a while. I'll call the imperial doctor. Tell him if you feel uncomfortable." "I'm much better." She sat up from the bed with her hands supported, looked up at Tang Ning, and asked, "They all say you are very smart. Can I ask you a question?" Tang Ning looked at her and said, "Ask me." She raised her head, her face still a little pale, looked at Tang Ning, and asked with confusion, "If you are not wrong and I am not wrong, then who is wrong? Why is the grassland at war with you? Why do so many people die? It's not good to fight and kill too much. Can't everyone be good?" There are no answers to these questions, or everyone has different answers. Tang Ning looked at her and said, "You need to find the answers to these questions yourself." Being able to ask such questions shows that she is still a simple girl. The answers to these questions are cruel. By the time she can answer herself, she will have almost grown up. Wan Yanyan sat on the bed, stunned for a while, sniffed, turned her eyes to the side, and asked, "What is this?" Tang Ning looked at the remaining half of the jar of wine and said, "Wine. I heard that the wine you Han people drink is very delicious. You can forget all your worries after drinking it," she murmured, picked up the wine jar, and drank heavily. Cough. Cough. She covered her mouth, coughed violently, and shed tears. She raised her head, looked at Tang Ning, and cried, "Liar, it doesn't taste good at all. You can't forget your worries after drinking it. Liar, you are all liars." First release of this chapter like Have Voice Novel Network, please remember the URL. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 363. Wan Yanyan got sick inexplicably, and got well again inexplicably. Net. In the morning, she was still unconscious with a high fever, but in the afternoon, she was full of energy and ate 3 bowls of tofu pudding. Wan Yanyan wiped her mouth and asked, "Are all Han people as smart as you?" Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "In fact, There are not many Han people as smart as me. There are not many Han people as thick-skinned as you. Wang Yanyan glanced at him, picked up the long knife on the table, and started chopping in the yard. She was wearing Zhao Man's clothes, and her hair was not braided into a small braid like before, but into a tassel bun, with a golden hairpin on her head, dressed like a typical Han woman. Of course, she came from the grassland, so she still looked quite exotic, and wearing Han clothes, she looked a little unique. Tang Ning stood at the door and looked at her for a while, not for her beauty, but for her knife skills. She swung the whip in a proper manner, but her knife skills were really terrible, with many flaws. Either she didn't learn well, or her master was just a half-baked one. Even Tang Ning could see the flaws in her knife skills, which showed how bad her knife skills were. In order to confirm his guess, he looked at Zheng the butcher and asked, "Old Zheng, what do you think of her knife skills?" Zheng the butcher was drinking, and he didn't even raise his head when he heard it, saying, "I don't know knife skills." Speaking of which, Tang Ning didn't seem to have seen him use a knife properly. The only time he saw him use it was when he was holding a butcher knife in his hand, which was no different from butchering pigs and chopping meat on weekdays. The old beggar once said that the more skilled a person is, the less he will pursue fancy and complicated moves. Tang Ning couldn't even reach the threshold of this level at the moment, and he didn't even know fancy and complicated moves. However, everything has a process. Even though old Zheng has now reached the state of seeing mountains as mountains and water as water, it will not be achieved overnight. Tang Ning did not believe him when he said that he did not know knife skills. Butcher Zheng took a sip of wine, looked up, and said, "She does not know knife skills either." Wang Yanyan's ears were quite sharp. She came over after hearing what he said, looked at Butcher Zheng, and asked, "You said I don't know knife skills, do you understand?" Butcher Zheng continued to drink and ignored her. Wang Yanyan clenched the knife in her hand and asked, "Do you dare to compete with me in knife skills?" Butcher Zheng raised his right hand and casually made a knife-swinging motion. At this moment, Tang Ning felt that the hair on his body stood up, and cold sweat broke out on his forehead instantly. Clang! Wang Yanyan's eyes were filled with fear, and the long knife in her hand fell to the ground. Just now, she seemed to feel that the person opposite was not waving his hand, but an extremely sharp knife. Her back was instantly soaked with cold sweat, her face was pale, her legs were weak, and she couldn't take a step. Butcher Zheng shook his head and turned to leave. Plop! Wang Yanyan finally collapsed to the ground. Tang Ning helped her up and walked towards her room, saying earnestly, "There are always stronger people among the strong, and there are always higher mountains. Don't want to fight with everyone you meet. If you meet someone with a bad temper, you are dead now." Wang Yanyan and Tang Yaoyao are a bit similar, but the difference is that Tang Yaoyao will not overestimate her own abilities. She will only bully people she can beat. The little girl on the grassland is a bit reckless. This kind of character will suffer a great loss in the future. However, Lao Zheng's strength still exceeded his imagination. He wanted to make the little girl's legs weak just by momentum. I don't know if he can do it in this life. Since her body is better, there is no need to delay any longer. The next morning, the delegation set off again. After a serious illness, Wang Yanyan finally stopped shouting that she wanted to kill him all day long, and the changes that happened to her during this period were not limited to this. It took her half a month to finally learn how to use chopsticks. If you only look at her appearance and behavior, you can no longer tell that she is a grassland girl. Half a month after entering the state of Chu, the delegation changed from land to water, but after only 2 days, they changed to land again. The state of Chen had an army that was familiar with water, but the imperial guards were in the palace all year round and could not get used to the bumps on the water, so they vomited all over the place. Zhao Man and Wang Yanyan were not much better, and even Tang Ning felt a little uncomfortable, so he had to order to land. 2 days were still like this. If it lasted a few more days, the delegation would probably be tossed to the point of being half dead. In this way, the time would naturally be a few days later than expected. On the 9th day of the 6th lunar month, more than 3 months had passed since leaving the state of Chen. In the dense forest of a state in the state of Chu, Lu Teng jumped off his horse, walked up to Tang Ning, and said, "Sir, we will be in the capital of the state of Chu at noon tomorrow." Tang Ning also breathed a sigh of relief. He had never traveled such a long distance in his 2 lives. This journey was finally coming to an end. Swoosh! As soon as he finished speaking, there was a sound of breaking wind, and an arrow shot out from the forest and nailed to a tree in front. Lu Teng's face changed and he shouted, "Be alert." Many guards drew their weapons. One of them pulled out the arrow nailed to the tree and said, "Sir, here is a piece of cloth with words on it." Tang Ning waved his hand and said, "Bring it over and have a look." He took the piece of cloth and looked up. "Mr. Tang, 3 miles to the north, you personally bring people to exchange your deputy envoy." Lu Teng looked and said, "I will lead 100 guards to exchange Mr. He back." Tang Ning shook his head and said, "They specifically asked me to go. 100 people are too many. I can take 50 people. If they make a feint to the east and attack the west, it will be easier to deal with them here." He put away the cloth and walked to a carriage in front. He knocked on the carriage. Wang Yanyan's head popped out and asked, "Are you eating so soon?" "Let's go." Tang Ning looked at her and said, "Your people are here to pick you up." "So soon?" Wang Yanyan's face showed surprise at first, then she hesitated and asked, "Can we finish the meal before leaving?" Tang Ning asked her to eat 3 bowls of tofu brain and bring 10 buns. Then he took Lao Zheng and 50 guards to the north 3 miles away. The distance of 3 miles is not long, and it was reached in a flash. More than 10 figures appeared in the open space in the forest ahead. "Master," Wang Yanyan shouted and ran over quickly. The guards behind her were about to stop her, but Tang Ning waved her hand and several guards stopped and let her run. Several people in the crowd on the opposite side came forward, their faces excited, and they chattered something to her. Wang Yanyan also chattered back a few words. She probably said something like "I'm fine and don't worry," but Tang Ning couldn't understand the rest. During this month, Tang Ning occasionally taught her some deeper usage of Chinese, and she also taught Tang Ning some simple grassland language. A man looked at Wang Yanyan and murmured, "Princess, you seem different from before." Wang Yanyan looked at him and asked, "What's different?" The man scratched his head and said, "It seems fatter than before." Tang Ning still knew how to say fat in grassland dialect. 2 days ago, he accidentally discovered that in the past month, the little girl seemed to be a lot fatter than before. This was normal. She ate 3 meals a day, 3 bowls of rice per meal, and stayed in the carriage all day without exercise. It would be strange if she didn't get fat. Of course, her body was originally thin, and now she just looked a little plump. Strictly speaking, she was not fat. Wang Yanyan grabbed the man and beat him up. Tang Ning took 2 steps forward, looked at the middle-aged woman, and asked, "Where is Lord He?" The middle-aged woman looked behind her and said, "Give him the man." 2 people walked out from behind him, pushed out a figure, kicked him on the butt, and shouted, "Go." Tang Ning looked at the man in front of him with ragged clothes, messy hair, and a dirty face, which was even more tattered than the most sloppy beggar he had ever seen, and asked in surprise, "Are you, Lord He?" Hirui looked down at himself, then looked up at the woman opposite him who was dressed in silk, wearing pearls and jade on her head, and had a radiant face. Thinking of what he had experienced along the way, he could no longer hold back the pain in his heart, and couldn't help crying out loud, tears streaming down his face. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Wrong xiao wrong. Chapter 364. Not fat, not fat. The man was hit on the head several times by Wan Yanyan, then he covered his head and said, "They didn't treat the princess badly." Wan Yanyan hit him on the head again and said, "You can't treat him badly here, you should abuse him." The man protected his head and said, "Princess, the clothes look good." The middle-aged woman looked at her and said, "Let's go." "Let's go." Wan Yanyan nodded, walked 2 steps and then stopped, her eyes a little nostalgic. This month, although she was a hostage, she had good food to eat and beautiful clothes to wear. As long as she could take a bath comfortably in the city, which even made her feel that there was nothing wrong with being a Han woman. After I left, those delicious foods were no longer available. She tightened the big bag on her back, which contained beautiful clothes and sparkling jewelry that she had accumulated over the past month. Although they were all worn and used by others, she still liked them very much. He suddenly turned his head, looked at Tang Ning, and said, "Next time we meet, I won't lose to you again. Then, be careful with your butt." After that, she left with the middle-aged woman and her group, never looking back. Wan Yanyan's threats went in and out of Tang Ning's ears. The gap between her and him was just like the gap between him and Tang Yao Yao. It would be difficult to catch up in this life. See you next time, whose butt needs to be careful. Must. He looked at the 2 guards beside him and said, "Why are you still standing there? Why don't you help Mr. He back quickly?" The return of Hirui, the deputy wedding envoy, made the atmosphere of the whole team high. For the sake of the safety of the soldiers, they were willing to take risks and be taken away by the enemy as hostages, suffering all kinds of abuse and humiliation. What a great righteousness! An official looked at Hirui and said angrily, "Those prairie barbarians are so crazy. Look how Master He was tortured." "Master He, you have lost weight." Tang Ning looked at Hirui, shook her head and said, "If I had known that they would do this to you, I would have taught their hostages a lesson and avenged you." Hirui no longer cared about being a hostage, one in the sky or the other in the earth. He stretched out his sleeves to wipe his nose, and turned around and said, "My lords, can you go out first? I have something important to report to Mr. Tang." Hearing this, everyone thought that Hirui had some secret information about the other party, and they all retreated. Tang Ning poured a cup of tea for Hirui and said, "Master He, if you need anything, please speak slowly and don't be in a hurry." Hirui picked up the teacup and put it down again. He suddenly stood up straight, bowed at 90 degrees, and said, "Master Tang, it was my fault that I was the official. A month ago, I actually wanted to do harm to Master Tang all the way. King Duan takes credit." He slapped himself in the face and said, "It's the ghost of Xiaoguan who has lost his mind. It's Xiaoguan who deserves to die. Mr. Tang, please forgive me." Tang Ning watched him slap her face one after another, and said in surprise, "Master He, what are you doing?" Hirui raised his head and said firmly, "Xiaoguan thought a lot along the way, and deeply regretted his previous thoughts. From now on, Xiaoguan will only follow Mr. Tang's lead, and please forgive Mr. Tang for what he said before mistakes committed." Tang Ning thought that after Hirui suffered so much, he would come back and accuse him and make things worse, but she never expected that he would actually pull such a trick, and he was not prepared at all. He looked at Hirui. Could it be that he wanted to pretend to surrender to him, but was actually working as an undercover agent with him to steal important information? "Sir, the mission that King Duan gave to Xiaoguan during this trip is to prevent King Kong from marrying Princess Changning no matter what. If there is a chance, I will also get rid of you on the way." Fortunately, Xiaoguan suddenly came to his senses and was willing to return to the Tang dynasty. "Your Excellency," Hirui looked at him and said sternly, "I swear to God that if I tell a lie, I will be struck by thunder and I will die. This oath is indeed very serious. Although you can't trust him right away, you can still stay and investigate." Tang Ning looked at him and said with a smile, "Sir, what you said is serious. As envoys, we should help each other." Hirui suddenly knelt down and said, "Xiaoguan has decided to submit to Mr. Tang. If Mr. Tang points to the east, I will never go west." He looked up at Tang Ning, his eyes burning and sincere. Along the way, he was brutally abused and suffered a lot, and he really thought about it a lot. However, what he wanted to understand was that being an enemy of Tang Ning would not end well. This time he could save his life. What about the return journey after arriving in the capital of Chu? Not even halfway through the trip, he had already fallen into such a miserable situation. If Tang Ning remembered this, how could he survive to return to the capital? Whether King Duan's mission is more important or his own life is more important, this is a question that does not need to be considered at all. Even the Tang family and King Duan couldn't fight. How did Hirui get so obsessed with ghosts that he had the illusion that he could fight him? Tang Ning looked at Hirui and asked slowly, "Is Mr. He serious?" Hirui cupped his hands and said, "Every sentence comes from the heart." Tang Ning helped him up and said with a smile, "Master He, you have had a hard journey, you should go back and rest first." Seeing Tang Ning helping him up, Hirui finally breathed a sigh of relief and said hurriedly, "If you are driven by something in the future, Hirui will not hesitate to die." After letting go of the huge stone in his heart, he felt relaxed and his mouth felt dry for a while. He picked up the teacup just now and was about to drink it. "Lord He, wait a minute." Tang Ning stopped him, took another teacup, filled it with tea, handed it to him, and said, "The cup just now has gone cold. Master He, you'd better drink this cup." Hirui looked down at the teacup in his hand, his palms trembling slightly. Master Tang is still thoughtful. He put it down and took the tea that Tang Ning handed over again, with tears of emotion in his eyes. As Tang Ning walked out of the tent, Lu Tang came over and asked, "Is Mr. He okay?" "Master He, it's been a hard journey." Tang Ning sighed and said, "Let him have a good rest." Lu Tang looked at him and said, "Master He was captured because of our negligence. When we return to the capital, Master Tang can blame all the negligence on me. If it hadn't been for Tang Ning's careful deployment last time, the princess might have been kidnapped by them, and his subordinates would have suffered heavy losses. If the worst happened, as the deputy envoy responsible for security, he would have suffered the most serious consequences. Punishment. Even so, the fact that the deputy envoy was kidnapped is still a crime that cannot be shied away from. If Hirui returns to the capital to report the matter, Tang Ning, as the chief officer, cannot escape the blame." Tang Ning looked at him, patted his shoulder, and said, "Don't worry, Mr. He understands justice and can understand us." He looked ahead and said, "Let everyone cheer up, we will arrive at the capital of Chu State tomorrow." Chu State, Kyoto. Prince's Mansion. "We won't arrive until tomorrow." They are walking really slowly along the way. The Crown Prince of Chu put down the letter in his hand and asked, "Do you think I, King Ming, want to go out of the city to greet him?" "Excuse me, this must not be done." A man stepped forward and said quickly, "What a share! It is naturally impossible for a prince of a country to lower his rank. Not only that, before getting married, I cannot see Princess Pingyang of Chen State. This is an ancestral ritual and must never be abolished." The Prince of Chu frowned and said, "If I don't see her, how will I know whether she is beautiful or ugly, tall or short, fat or thin?" The man hurriedly advised, Don't be impatient. There are many people in the court watching me. If I make a mistake, wouldn't it give them another opportunity?" The Crown Prince of Chu slapped his hand on the table and said angrily, "Those old guys, all of them are thinking of letting King Xian replace me. When my father dies and I ascend the throne, the first thing to do is, just kill them all." Letter to the palace. The middle-aged man knocked on the door, walked into a certain room, and asked, "The envoy of the Ming and Chen kingdoms and Princess Pingyang are about to arrive in Beijing. Do you want to go and have a look? I'm not going. Li Tianlan raised his head and said, tomorrow I will accompany my mother and concubine to offer incense. You have forgotten that in addition to sending a bride this time, they also want to propose marriage. The middle-aged man looked at her and asked, you really don't want to go and see? Not going. Forget it if you don't go. The middle-aged man smiled and said, please spend time with your mother and concubine. You don't need to worry about Chen Guo's envoys. When the time comes, my father will take care of them all for you. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 365. Tang Ning sat on the horse, looking at the towering city wall in front of her, and let out a long sigh of relief. Setting off from the capital on the 3rd day of March, it was already the 9th day of June when we arrived in the capital of Chu State. After more than 3 months of bumps, this journey could finally come to an end for the time being. The main city gate is wide open, and no one is allowed to travel. There are people on both sides watching, and countless soldiers are guarding both sides of the road. At the front, more than 10 people in official uniforms are standing there. It seems that the waiting time has not been long. Congratulations to Princess Pingyang. An official bowed his hands, and the people behind him followed suit. This time when the envoys and princesses from the state of Chen arrived, the state of Chu gave them a great deal of pomp. They were greeted by many officials, headed by the Minister of Rites and the Minister of Honglu Temple. Both sides were filled with people, and the crowd was extremely crowded. Although this is not the highest courtesy, the Emperor of Chu is seriously ill, the prince avoids suspicion, and there are not many people in the royal family. This camp can be regarded as extremely sincere. The Minister of Rites of Chu State, a middle-aged man with a short beard, stepped forward, cupped his hands, and said, Your Majesty has heard the news of the princess's arrival in Beijing. Please ask the princess and the envoys to move to the Jingxia Palace first. The group entered the city gate and, led by the Minister of Rites, arrived at a palace outside the imperial palace. The princess has not yet been officially married, so naturally she cannot live in the palace. Splendid Palace is said to be a palace, but it is actually a large royal garden with mountains and rivers in the forest. It is large enough to house nearly 1,000 people's envoys, and it does not look like it. Crowded. Although he had already arrived in Chu State, Lu Teng immediately arranged for patrols after entering the courtyard without relaxing his vigilance at all. The Minister of Rites bowed his hand to Tang Ning and said, Princess and the envoy have worked hard all the way. You might as well rest in the splendid palace first. In 3 days, the court will hold a wedding banquet for you all. At that time, I will send someone to come pick you up. When the Minister of Rites left, he also took away Zhao Man's birth date, saying that he wanted to combine it with the prince's birth date to calculate an auspicious date for the wedding. Along the way, Zhao Man spent most of the time in a narrow carriage. Zhao Man's spirit had always been a little sluggish. Now that she finally didn't have to ride in a carriage, her mood did not improve at all. After Tang Ning found her after dealing with the Chu officials, she was sitting by the lake in the garden in a daze. A little palace maid saw him walking over, walked to the lake, pointed to the back, and said to the patrolling soldiers, Go patrol over there, don't disturb the princess. Tang Ning sat next to Zhao Man and asked, What are you thinking about? Zhao Man looked at the lake and said, This place is far, far away from the capital. Can we still go back? Don't worry, it will definitely work. Tang Ning held her hand and said with a little force, I swear. Zhao Man leaned her head on his shoulder and said, My heart has been given to you, and I will never marry anyone else even if I die. Tang Ning coughed lightly. She originally thought that the girl's impulse would eventually change with the passage of time, but she didn't expect that along the way, she would become more dependent on him. It's not the right time to think about something deeper, but at least he must be worthy of her trust in him. There was no movement around her for a long time. When Tang Ning lowered her head to look, She realized that she had fallen asleep at some point. This place by the lake was hers. Tang Ning picked her up and didn't have to worry about others seeing her. He walked back to the dormitory, placed her on the bed, and then returned to his own residence. Not long after, a guard came in to report. Hirui asks to see you. Tang Ning poured 2 cups of tea. Seeing Hirui come in, she handed him a cup and asked, "Master have some tea." Hirui had already picked up the teacup out of habit. He seemed to have thought of something, put it down again, and said, "Master Xie Tang, I am not thirsty." Tang Ning took a sip of her tea and asked, "What does Mr. He want from me?" Hirui stood up, cupped his hands and said, "Master Tang, among the envoys arriving in the capital this time, there are 2 more who were placed by King Duan. The purpose is to help him marry Princess Changning. The lower official has already they have talked about it, and Mr. Zhang and Mr. Li are willing to abandon the dark side and surrender to the light, and obey your arrangements." No wonder Hirui was able to sit in the position of Prime Minister of Honglu Temple. Along the way, other envoys sent in by King Duan did not have his eyesight and ability. Hirui looked at him and said, "We have the initiative on the marriage proposal. Your Excellency will only mention King Kong, not King Duan. When you go back, you can just make up a random reason to get rid of it. Whether it is King Duan or King Kong, there is no difference in this matter. Besides, he doesn't know much about the situation in Chu yet, so he doesn't want to act rashly for the time being." He looked at Hirui and said, "I have my own plan for this matter." Hirui didn't say much. He stood up, cupped his hands and said, "Then I'll take my leave first." He sat in the room for a while, and then Butcher Zhen walked in and said, "I have some things to do and I have to be away for a few days. You should be more careful during these days." Lao Zhen was originally escorting him along the way. Although he encountered dangers along the way, Tang Ning was able to solve them before he took action. When they arrived in Chu State, the Chu State's court cared more about their safety than their own. "There is no need to have him by your side for everything." Tang Ning thought for a while and asked, "How long will it take to leave? Do I have to wait for you when I get back?" 10 days and a half are enough." Tang Ning, who was still unable to leave after 10.5 months, nodded and said, "Be careful yourself." In fact, Tang Ning originally wanted to go out with him, but now that he had something to do and left, she had to go out alone. On a street somewhere in Kyoto, a young man stopped a woman and asked, "Madam, how to get to Xinwang Mansion?" The woman stopped, pointed ahead, and said, "Go forward from here, turn right at the 2nd intersection, turn left at the 3rd intersection, and keep walking straight ahead." "I know, thank you, ma'am." Half an hour later, Tang Ning stood outside the city gate, looking back at the towering city wall in a daze. He followed the route pointed by the lady and actually walked out of the city gate. Beyond that was the wilderness. Where was the Xinwang Mansion? It is true that the world is declining and people's hearts are not as old as they used to be. I didn't expect that the people's customs under the feet of the Emperor of Chu would be like this. If you don't know, you don't know. They actually gave him random directions and made him run for half an hour longer with just a few words. He walked back to the city gate, stopped a carriage carrying goods, and asked, "Brother, how can I get to Prince Xian's mansion?" The man pulling the cart scratched his head and said, "Prince Xian's mansion, that's far away. This is the west of the city, and Prince Xian's mansion is in the east of the city." "Who are you talking to?" a voice came from inside the carriage. The curtain was opened, and a middle-aged woman stuck her head out and scolded, "Hurry up and hurry up." Tang Ning looked at her and said, "Sister, I'm sorry, I just wanted to ask for directions." "Sister," the middle-aged woman touched her wrinkled face with a smile on her face and said, "Little brother, you are going to Xinwang Mansion. We are on the way, so why not give you a ride?" Tang Ning was stunned for a moment, then immediately held up her hands and said, "Then thank you, Eldest sister. Things like folk customs cannot be generalized. There are still good people in this world who are willing to help others. Tang Ning stood at the door of Prince Xian's mansion, sighed in her heart, walked forward and said, "May I ask if Princess Changning is in the mansion?" The soldier guarding the gate looked at him and asked, "Who are you?" Tang Ning cupped her hands and said, "Excuse me, I'd like to inform you that an old friend from the state of Chen is here to visit." "Some old friend?" The soldier looked at him and said, "8 out of 10 people who ask to see the princess every day have this reason. Can't you change it to a fresh one?" Tang Ning was stunned for a moment, then she said, "I am the wedding envoy from the state of Chen. I have something important to do with the princess. Please let me know." "No one has ever used this reason." The guard glanced at him and said, "But when you said you were the wedding messenger, did you mean the wedding messenger?" Tang Ning took out a sign from her arms and threw it over. After the guard took it, he was stunned for a moment. After looking over it over and over, he said, "Wait here for a while." He walked into the house, walked out quickly, handed the sign back to him, and said with a cupped hand, "It turns out to be the wedding messenger, but it's a pity that the princess has gone on a far journey, and you came at the wrong time." Going on a long trip, Tang Ning was stunned and asked, "When will you come back?" "Then I don't know." The guard shook his head and said, "It could be a month, it could be 3 months, if it's more, it could be a year and a half." "So long?" Tang Ning frowned. "Doesn't this mean that he won't be able to see her when he comes to Chu country this time?" In Prince Xian's mansion, the middle-aged man took a sip of tea, shook his head and said, "A mere 5th-grade official of the Chen kingdom wants to deceive my daughter. Fortunate young gentleman." Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 366. This time, the Chen state delegation came to Chu, nominally with the mission of seeking marriage. As a marriage envoy, it was normal for Tang Ning to come to the Xian Wang mansion. But he didn't expect that after he revealed his identity for the first time, he was still turned away here. Not only did he not drink a cup of tea, but he was not even allowed to enter the gate of Xian Wang mansion. Li Tianlan was away for a year or so, which was naturally the guard's excuse, indicating that someone in Xian Wang mansion did not want him to see her. This person is most likely the Xian Wang who was once powerful in Chu. However, it is not a bad thing that Xian Wang did not let him come. This is very likely to show that he does not support Li Tianlan's marriage to Chen state. Xian Wang has a very important position in the court. If he disagrees, this matter will certainly not be accomplished, which is exactly what Tang Ning wants. The only regret is that I haven't seen Li Tianlan for more than a year, and I don't know if she has lost weight or gained weight. Zhao Man sat opposite him with her chin propped up and asked, "What are you thinking about?" Tang Ning came to his senses, shook his head, and said, "Nothing." When a man said nothing, it meant something. Thinking of what she read in the book, Zhao Man blinked and asked, "Commander Lu said you went out just now. What did you do when you went out?" Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "To meet a friend." Zhao Man looked at him and asked, "Did you meet him?" Tang Ning shook his head, "No." "Why haven't I heard you say that you have friends in Chu?" Zhao Man looked into his eyes and asked, "Is it a girl?" Tang Ning nodded and said, "Yes." "Is she beautiful?" Tang Ning didn't answer, and Zhao Man didn't ask any more questions. She asked again, "Are you familiar with each other?" Tang Ning waved his hand and said, "Just a little familiar." Puji Temple. Puji Temple is located outside Kyoto, about 10 miles away from the city. The temple is always full of incense. In addition to ordinary people, the princes and nobles of Kyoto often go to the temple to burn incense and pray. Puji Temple, in a secluded Buddhist temple. A woman in luxurious clothes kneeled on the futon, clasped her hands together, and knelt quietly. Not far from her, a young woman leaned on the incense table, fiddling with a stick tube on the table, a little absent-minded. Lanlan, what are you doing? It was not until a voice came from the side that she came back to her senses and asked, are you going back? The woman looked at her and said, it is disrespectful to the Bodhisattva to be distracted in the Buddhist temple. What are you thinking about? Nothing. Li Tianlan shook his head and said, let's go. The woman looked at her and asked, what are you holding in your hand? Li Tianlan lowered her head and found that when she was distracted just now, she casually pulled out a stick from the stick tube. She was about to put it back, but the woman took it from her hand, looked at it, and murmured, what a night, meeting this good man, what is this? An old monk smiled and said, reply to the princess, the meaning of the fortune is that the one who gets this fortune can meet the person in the near future, or the friend you miss day and night, or the lover you miss in your heart. Li Tianlan threw it back and said, if everything in the world is determined by the fortune, put all the good fortune in it, wouldn't the world be full of good things? How can you talk in front of the Bodhisattva? The woman looked at her, immediately put her hands together, and murmured to the Bodhisattva statue in the hall, Lanlan is young and ignorant, Bodhisattva, please don't blame me, don't blame me. Eastern Palace. As soon as the Crown Prince of Chu stepped out of the palace gate, someone chased him from behind and said, Your Highness, you can't do that. You absolutely can't do that. If the censor sees you, you will be impeached again. My Crown Princess, I want to see her, who dares to stop me? The Crown Prince of Chu waved his hand and said, let them impeach her. I want to see how long they can be so proud. The man saw that he couldn't persuade him, so he said bitterly, Your Highness, even if you want to see her, change into casual clothes and let the guards take you to see her secretly, so you can avoid some trouble. The young man stood at the gate of the East Palace, thought about it, nodded and said, that's right, although I'm not afraid of them, I'm also annoyed by the flies. He walked back and said, call a few people and go to Jingxia Palace with me later. In Jingxia Palace, by the lake, Tangning and Zhao Man were holding fishing rods and sitting by the lake. It had been a while, but no fish had been hooked. Zhao Man said a few days ago that he wanted to go fishing. Today, he found a lake in Jingxia Palace. Tangning had someone set up a nest an hour ago, but now, 2/4 of an hour have passed, and there is not even a fish biting the hook. Tangning shook his head and said, it seems that there are no fish in this lake. Let's go back. Zhao Man held the fishing rod, shook his head, and said indifferently, if there are no fish, there are no fish. We sit here and talk. Tangning threw the fishing hook farther away and asked, what are you talking about? Zhao Man looked at him and smiled, tell me about your friend. What's her name? Tangning thought for a while and said, Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan. Zhao Man thought for a while and felt that the name sounded familiar. It took a while for him to remember it. He was surprised and said, the friend you are talking about is the Princess Changning of Chu. Tangning nodded. Zhao Man held the fishing rod tightly in his hand and asked, how did you know each other? The acquaintance with Li Tianlan was just a coincidence. Later, they had a tit-for-tat confrontation at the Lumming banquet, and they were not acquainted without fighting. Then when she was attacked on the street, she acted righteously, almost endangering her life, and the two became real life and death friends. Later, after gradually becoming familiar with each other, I discovered that the two people had surprisingly consistent views on many things. They even liked to eat the same things. The compatibility was extremely high, similar to the relationship between mountains and rivers. It is rare to have a confidant in life, and nationality is not the reason why they cannot become a confidant. Zhao Man held her chin with one hand and murmured with envy on her face, so you guys have known each other so long, and she even saved your life. She looked at Tangning again and asked, isn't she beautiful? She is very beautiful. Tangning nodded and said, she is probably as beautiful as you. The look of disappointment on Zhao Man's face soon turned into joy. At this moment, Tang Ning suddenly turned around and said loudly, "Who?" Several figures came from behind. Zhao Man's maid sent the guards elsewhere. Tang Ning didn't know any of these people. Those few people did not expect that there would be people in such a remote place by the lake, so that they were exposed as soon as they came in from the outside. Zhao Man's maid was already calling for the guards. Among the 5 people, the expressions of the 4 at the back changed. The one at the front looked at Tang Ning, then at Zhao Man, and said, "Who are you two? Ghost, what are you doing sneaking around here?" Unexpectedly, the other party actually shouted, "Catch the thief!" Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "Who are you?" The young man put his hands behind his back, looked at him arrogantly, and said, "Ben." He said something and then changed his tone, "Who do you care who I am?" A young general led a group of guards and ran over quickly, waving his hand and saying, "Get these assassins for me." When the guards approached, the 4 people behind the young man drew their weapons and protected him. "You still dare to resist?" The young general waved his hand and said, "Anyone who dares to resist will be shot without mercy." Bold, one of them stepped forward, looked at the young general, and said loudly, "This is the prince of the East Palace. How dare you pretend to be the prince?" The young general kicked him away and said angrily, "Why did the prince come here? Take them all." The young man became furious and shouted loudly, "How outrageous! I am the prince, why don't you put down your weapons? How brave you are to sneak into the princess's palace and pretend to be the prince." The young general kicked him over and waved, "Hit me." Although the 4 of them were very skilled, they were unable to defeat the 4 with their fists and were quickly captured. Only the young man held his head while enduring the punches and kicks, and shouted, "I am really a prince, you are so bold, you are so brave. How dare you say you are the prince?" The young general kicked him again and asked, "Tell me, who are you and what are you doing here?" "I am the prince." The young general kicked the ball flying, "You still said that." The young man held his head and said, "I am really a prince." "Stubborn," the young general snorted coldly and kicked him again, "Who are you?" "I am the prince. I am the prince." After being kicked countless times, the young man finally let go of his hand and said feebly, "I am not the prince." "Not the prince?" The young general looked at him, waved his hand and said, "You dare to pretend to be the prince, give me a beating." You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 367. Hearing that an assassin had sneaked into Jingxia Palace, Lu Teng hurried over and asked, "Is the princess okay?" Tang Ning looked at the assassin who had been knocked unconscious and said, "Nothing." The young general came over and asked, "Sir Tang, Commander Lu, how should we deal with these assassins?" Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "This is Chu after all, let's hand them over to the Chu government." "Send them to the government." The young general turned around, waved his hand, and murmured, "They are so brave. Not only did they intend to assassinate the princess, but they even dared to pretend to be the prince." All 5 assassins were tied up and sent to the government. Lu Teng turned around and looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Sir Tang, what's going on?" Tang Ning shook his head. He was just fishing and talking with Zhao Man here. These people suddenly appeared and claimed to be the prince. After being beaten, they were indeed much more honest. The next thing will be handled by the Chu government. Jingzhou Yamen. There is nothing trivial about the affairs of envoys. After hearing the news that Princess Pingyang was assassinated in Jingxia Palace, Jing Zhaoyan immediately put down the affairs in his hands and hurried to the front yamen. This is the first day that the Chen state delegation arrived in Kyoto. Even a day has not passed, and such a thing has happened. If it is not handled properly, how will Chen state, as a friendly country, look at them? If the relationship between the two countries is affected by this, the matter will be serious. He walked into the hall quickly and asked, "What's going on?" A yamen runner said, "Sir, these people broke into Jingxia Palace, where Princess Pingyang of Chen State lived, and pretended to be the prince. After being arrested, they were sent here, impersonating the prince and assassinating the princess. Either of these two charges is a capital crime." Jing Zhaoyan asked, "Where is the assassin?" The yamen runner said, "He has been locked up in the prison." "Take me to see." Jingzhou Mansion, inside the prison. The crown prince of Chu had already woken up, trembling with anger, and said in a cold tone, "I will kill them, I want them to die." As the crown prince, he was also the only prince of Chu. He had never been treated like this since he was a child. If this revenge is not avenged, he will feel uneasy. A person beside him immediately stepped forward and said, "Your Highness, you must not be impulsive. We have made a big mistake by sneaking into Jingxia Palace privately. If the court knows, they will definitely not give up. Now, we can only conceal this matter and discuss it again." The crown prince of Chu gritted his teeth and said, "Let me forget it, I can't swallow this breath." "Your Highness, think twice. If this matter is spread out, your Highness will lose face," someone immediately explained. "Besides, it's not just about letting it go. This is Chu. After we go back, we will find a way to help your Highness get revenge." Before the crown prince of Chu answered, footsteps came from the front. "Assassinating the princess, pretending to be the prince, who ordered you to do this?" Jing Zhaoyan's voice came before the people arrived. "Open your dog eyes and look." The prince of Chu came over suddenly and asked, "Look, am I pretending to be me?" The person behind him also came out immediately and said, "Why don't you let your Highness out?" Jing Zhaoyan looked at the bruised and swollen prince of Chu, his eyelids jumped, and he immediately said, "Open the prison door." The prison door opened, a man came out, looked at Jing Zhaoyan, and said, "Don't tell anyone about what happened today." Before the wedding, the prince sneaked into the residence of the princess of another country, which was a challenge to etiquette. Once it was spread out, he would immediately become the target of attack by the ministers in the court. If the infiltration was successful, it would be fine. If the infiltration failed, he would be caught as an assassin, beaten up and sent to the government. If this matter was spread out, it would definitely become the biggest joke in Kyoto this year. Although the prince was already a joke in Kyoto, with this joke added, I am afraid that more people will think that such a prince cannot become a qualified emperor. Jing Zhaoyan bowed and said, "Your Highness, don't worry. I will keep this matter a secret." After several people left, he turned around and looked at a constable behind him and said, "Do you know what to do?" "Don't worry, sir." The constable nodded and said, "I know." Within half a day, the news that the prince and 4 guards broke into Jingxia Palace and were arrested by the guards of Princess Pingyang of Chen State as assassins, beaten up, and sent to Jingzhou Prefecture Yamen was known to everyone. Princess Pingyang was the crown princess that the prince had not yet married. Before that, the two could not meet. This was the etiquette. The prince ignored the etiquette and had become the target of impeachment and memorial by the imperial censors of the whole court. As a prince, he was beaten as an assassin, which made the prince once again a laughing stock in Kyoto. In Prince Xian's mansion, an imperial censor looked at Prince Xian and said, "I think the envoys of the state of Chen have also heard the news. This time, the prince has completely lost face for our Chu state." He paused and said, "Now, many people in the court think that the Chen envoys should hand over the people who beat the prince and punish them severely to save face." Prince Xian waved his hand and said, "Okay, you still think it's not embarrassing enough, let's just leave it at that and don't discuss it anymore." The young imperial censor thought for a while and asked, "The prince violated the etiquette?" Prince Xian stood up and said, "Forget it." The imperial censor looked up and finally just sighed and bowed his hands and said, I'll take my leave. After a while, at the censorate, the censor looked at the young censor and asked, "What does the prince say?" The young censor bowed his head and said, "His Royal Highness Xin Wang means that in this matter, don't make things difficult for the prince." The censor shook his head and said, "In fact, our biggest obstacle is not the prince, but the prince. If the prince is unwilling, even if all the people in the court are added together, it is impossible to force him." The young censor raised his head and asked, "Then this matter?" The censor sighed and said helplessly, "Listen to the prince." In Jingxia Palace. After dinner, Tang Ning listened to Lu Teng's words and was surprised. "Is it really the Prince of Chu?" "It has spread outside." Lu Teng nodded and said, "It should be the Prince of Chu." The young general standing behind Lu Teng supported the table, his legs were weak, and his face was pale. Relaxed, Tang Ning patted his shoulder and said, "The more this matter is known to everyone, the less you will have to do with it. The Chu court also has to save face and will not punish you." The young general who had just beaten up the Chu prince was shaking and looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Sir Tang, is it true?" "Just be happy by yourself." Tang Ning looked at him and said, "You will never have a second chance in your life to beat up the prince." The young general took the reassurance pill and left. Tang Ning looked at Lu Teng again and asked, "What did the Chu court say?" Lu Teng thought for a moment and said, "Some people advocate that we hand over the people who beat the prince and punish them severely, but some people think that the prince violated the etiquette first. Although we should not beat the prince, it is understandable to protect the princess." Tang Ning shook his head and murmured, "It seems that this prince is not very popular in the court." Eastern Palace. The Prince of Chu smashed a few cups and said angrily, "What, this matter is just over?" This matter was still leaked, which means that he not only got beaten, but also lost face. Now the court does not intend to investigate the matter. How can he swallow this breath? Princess Pingyang didn't see it, and someone found it? He turned his anger to the guards behind him and shouted, "Is it a bunch of waste that I raise you?" The guard immediately said, "Your Highness, in fact, we have seen Princess Pingyang." The Prince of Chu raised his eyebrows. "What?" The guard said, "The woman we saw by the lake is Princess Pingyang." The Crown Prince of Chu was stunned, thinking of the woman who amazed him by the lake, and asked, "Is she Princess Pingyang?" The guard nodded and immediately said, "Yes." The Crown Prince of Chu thought for a while and asked again, "Who is the person next to her?" The guard shook his head and said, "I don't know." The Crown Prince of Chu said with a gloomy face, "I want all his information within an hour." Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 368. The Chu court did not express any response to the beating of the prince yesterday. Early the next morning, guards came to report the incident and someone came from the East Palace. The East Palace is where the prince's power lies. When Tang Ning arrived at a certain hall, Lu Teng was already inside. Lu Teng pointed to the official of the prince's mansion and introduced, "This is Prince Zhan Shi, Lord Wang." Tang Ning cupped her hands and said, "I wonder what Wang Zhan is doing now." Prince Zhan Shi looked at him and said, "Yesterday, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince was beaten by thugs in the Jingxia Palace. The prince's mansion hopes that the two adults can hand over the leading villain and let the prince's mansion deal with it." The young general standing behind Lu Teng trembled. Tang Ning looked at Prince Zhan Shi and asked, "Is this the intention of your imperial court or the East Palace?" Prince Zhan Shi raised his eyebrows and asked, "Is there any difference?" Tang Ning looked at him, suddenly smiled, and said, "What a coincidence. After knowing that yesterday's assassin turned out to be the prince, we already severely punished him and asked him to pack his things and go back. Wang Zhan came a step too late." Prince Zhan Shi looked at him, narrowed his eyes and said, "Beating the prince is a serious crime. I hope your envoy can understand." Tang Ning said, "So we punished him severely and let him go back." Prince Zhan Shi's eyes narrowed even more, and a fierce light emerged from the narrow gap. Tang Ning looked at him and said in surprise, "Is Wang Zhenqi sleeping? If he is, he should go back and rest early." "You." Prince Zhanshi pointed at him, then just waved his sleeves and strode away. Naturally, there is no comparison between the prince's palace and the imperial court. If these Chen state envoys are unwilling to surrender, they will not be able to use any strong methods. Even if the other party's excuses are too casual, he can only temporarily suppress them. Get angry. After Prince Zhanshi left, the young general behind Lu Teng immediately stood up and bowed. "My subordinate, Chen Zhou, would like to thank Mr. Tang." "You're welcome. Every move you make here is related to Chen Guo's reputation. Naturally, I can't hand you over." Tang Ning patted his shoulder and said, "You have time, teach me how to tie the rope from last time." Although Lu Teng's subordinate has an unlucky name, he does have some skills. "I'm going to see the princess," he said to Lu Teng and walked out of the hall. "Yesterday I promised Zhao Man to go fishing, but unfortunately there were no fish in the lake in Jingxia Palace. It just so happened that I had nothing to do today, so I could take her out to get some fresh air." She helped Zhao Man put on her makeup, changed into the palace maid's clothes, and walked out of the palace in a swaggering manner. At the door, a young general named Chen Zhou raised his head and glanced. His eyes widened immediately. He quickly stood up, bowed and said, "Mr." Lu Teng looked over, and Chen Zhou looked at Tang Ning, then at Zhao Man, and said loudly, "Mr., I send you my best wishes, Mr. Tang." After walking out of Jingxia Palace, Zhao Man patted his chest and said, "I think he recognized me just now." Tang Ning looked at her. She was in a hurry today and her makeup had not changed much. However, usually no one would look at her face. She was already out and there was no need to go back. However, this is the Chu Kingdom, and there is no guarantee that there won't be people with ulterior motives around the Jingxia Palace. Old Zheng left, and just in case, Tang Ning brought a few elite disciples of the beggar gang with him. Having been deceived by that lady yesterday, she traveled across most of Kyoto. Tang Ning knew where the river was, so she and Zhao Man brought fishing rods and found a suitable location for fishing. They are not the only ones fishing here. The best spot is occupied by someone else. He is a middle-aged man wearing a Confucian shirt and holding a fishing rod in his hand. He looks calm and relaxed. Tang Ning and Zhao Man passed by him and saw a few small fish in a jar beside him. This showed that there were fish to catch here. Tang Ning made a nest here and dropped the hook, then sat on the rocks with Zhao Man and waited for a fish to bite the hook. Unfortunately, their luck was not very good today. Since they sat down, the middle-aged man had already caught 3 fish in a row, but neither he nor Zhao Man caught even one. After the middle-aged man caught another fish, he looked over and said, "Young man, there are no fish in that place. You'd better come here." "Thank you." This middle-aged man seemed to be very familiar with this area of water. He must have been fishing here often. Tang Ning and Zhao Man moved to where he was, and soon she caught the first small fish as big as a palm. Zhao Man said happily, "I caught it before you did." "You're amazing, you're amazing." Tang Ning helped her take the fish off the hook and said, "Keep your voice down, don't disturb others fishing." "It doesn't matter, I'm going back to." The middle-aged man poured all the fish in the jar into the river, put away the fishing rod, slowly wound the line, and said casually, "I have been fishing here for many years, and this is the first time I have encountered young people like you who have a leisurely life." Tang Ning shook her head and asked, "Why can't young people have leisure time?" The middle-aged man said, "Young people should take it as their duty to read and serve the country, take the books of sages as entertainment, and enjoy poetry and articles. How can they waste their time on these pastimes?" Tang Ning lifted up the fishing rod, took off a small fish from the hook, and said, "Not all young people like reading. Not everyone loves poetry and articles. Everyone has the right to choose. If you don't even know what to do for fun, if you can't choose for yourself, there's nothing good about being an emperor. The middle-aged man put away the fishing rod, stood up, and asked, "Young man, do you know how good it is to be an emperor? Above millions of people, is there anything you can't choose for yourself?" Tang Ning cast down the fishing hook and asked, "When the emperor wants to fish, can he sit here and fish?" The middle-aged man was stunned at first, then looked at him with strange eyes, nodded and said, "Yes, the emperor can do a lot of things, but he can't sit here and fish like you." I don't know if it's because the middle-aged man just let go of a lot of fish. Tang Ning just cast down the fishing hook, and the fishing rod shook. However, this time he didn't pay attention to the fishing rod, but stood up, turned around, and looked at the shore. A few steps away from them, several figures covered in cloaks appeared. Several people holding weapons were running towards the river. The first thing Tang Ning thought of was that someone wanted to assassinate Zhao Man. The waters of Chu were indeed deep. The prince's grandmother didn't love him, and no one stood up when he was beaten. On the second day after the delegation arrived, someone dared to assassinate the princess in the street. He waved his hand, and the 10 beggars' disciples standing not far away blocked these people. In an instant, they formed a formation and surrounded those people. These disciples were the elite of the elite, and they were trained by the old beggar himself. They were very extraordinary when they formed a formation. There were only 5 people on the other side. Although they were not bad, they were trapped in the formation and could only be beaten. After a while, the 5 people were knocked unconscious by the sticks in the hands of those disciples. Not far away, there were already officials running over. Zhao Man ran out secretly, and if they were found by them, she would be in trouble. Tang Ning threw down the fishing rod, grabbed her hand, and said, "Go." The 10 beggars' disciples also left quickly, and more than a dozen officials ran over and took down the 5 people lying on the ground who had fainted. A man ran out of the crowd, ran to the middle-aged man, and asked, "Why did you come out alone again?" The middle-aged man handed him the fishing rod and said, "With you here, the fish are scared away. What can I catch?" The man frowned and said, "But this is too dangerous." "It's nothing." The middle-aged man clapped his hands, looked at the direction where Tang Ning and Zhao Man disappeared, and said, "Go back. Don't tell the princess and the princess about what happened today." The man looked in another direction and said, "The princess already knows." The woman in white walked over from the crowd, looked at the middle-aged man, and said, "Next time you want to fish, don't come out alone. I'll accompany you." "Okay, okay, whatever Lanlan says is what I want." The middle-aged man waved his hand and said, "You are late this time. I just met a young man who likes fishing like you. Fortunate young gentleman." Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 369. Tang Ning pulled Zhao Man and trotted all the way to a certain street corner. She looked back and found that no official was chasing her. The fishing rod was lost, but the fish he caught was still there. Tang Ning sighed and said, "Today's fishing was in vain again." He thought about it carefully and realized that something was not right about what just happened. No one in Chu State knew him, let alone Zhao Man, and no one knew that he would sneak the princess out. There was no reason for him to do so. The assassin comes for you. However, no matter who the targets of those assassins were, they were all beaten. It was useless to think about it. The fishing was disturbed and they had no choice but to go home. Zhao Man was led by him, her hands clasped tightly, and she said with a flushed face, "It doesn't matter, you can do it another time. It's better not to go out fishing another day. The public security in Kyoto, Chu Kingdom, is extremely bad. There are actually assassinations on the street. It would be better to buy some fish and put them in the lake of Jingxia Palace." After their fishing failed, he and Zhao Man walked on the street, planning to go shopping before going back. When passing by a bookstore, Tang Ning saw a sign erected at the door of the bookstore. The sign had a catalogue of recent new books. Tang Ning just glanced at it casually and discovered a few familiar words such as the fairy match and the legend of the white snake. Zhao Man was surprised. Why are they sold here? Tang Ning stood at the door, looked at it, and said, go in and have a look. At a certain moment, he was still guessing whether he was not the only one who walked out of that door, and there were others from the same place as him. But when he walked to the bookstore, he found that the author of these two books was also Tang Ning. In addition to the legend of the white snake and the immortal match, books such as The Peony Pavilion and The Romance of the West Chamber are also placed in very conspicuous positions. He picked up a book and read it. The content in the book was exactly the same as that in Tang Renzai, and even the layout and cover were copied exactly. It's a pity that this is not in Chen State, and there is no copyright law. Otherwise, these few books alone could make these unscrupulous pirated booksellers bankrupt. What kind of books do you want to buy? A bookstore clerk came over and said, Sir, you really have a good eye. These books in your hand are the most popular ones in our store in recent days. It is said that they are from Chengguo. Even Her Royal Highness the Princess likes the work of the 3UN number 1 scholar. If you had come a day later, everything would have been sold out. Tang Ning raised her eyebrows. Princess, princess. The clerk said, my guest doesn't know that every time a batch of his new books are sold in the store, the princess will come to buy them in person. In addition to the princess, the ladies from the princes and noble families in the city also like these very much. Tang Ning was not interested in those princes and ladies and asked, which princess? The clerk looked at him, scratched his head and said, Your Majesty, is there any other princess in Kyoto? Of course I am talking about Princess Changning. Yesterday, His Highness the Princess came here to ask if there were any new books. Tang Ning frowned and asked, didn't Princess Changning go on a long trip? Your Majesty, you are joking. The waiter smiled and said, I just saw the princess passing by here. I don't know where your Majesty heard the rumor. It seemed that someone in Prince Xian's mansion really didn't want him to see Li Tianlan, so they made up a random reason to fool him. Now things are a bit difficult to handle. If the person behind the scenes is King Xian, there is nothing that the other party can't do in Chu State. He can't even enter King Xian's palace. Unless he was guarding the door of Prince Xian's mansion, but he was not so free. Fortunately, he already knew that she was in Kyoto, so he didn't have to worry about not having a chance to see her. He put down the books in his hands, looked at Zhao Man, and said, go back. This matter is not urgent. They will stay in Chu State for a long time, and the future is long. Returning to Jingxia Palace, before reaching the door of Zhao Man's bedroom, he saw several envoys wandering in front of his door with anxious expressions on their faces. Seeing him coming back, Hirui immediately came over and said, Master Tang, you are back, something big has happened. You go back first, Tang Ning said to Zhao Man, then looked at Hirui and asked, Master He, what happened? Hirui said, the Wanyan ministry sent envoys to Beijing. They just arrived an hour ago, and Chu State has already sent people to receive them. Wanyan department. Tang Ning was startled when he heard this. Grassland and Chen and Chu have always been incompatible and have never established diplomatic relations. Why did they send envoys here? He looked at Hirui and asked, do you know their purpose? We don't know yet. Hirui shook his head and said, but we just arrived yesterday, and they entered the city today. They must be evil. The alliance strategy between Chen and Chu directly curbed the expansion of the Wanyan tribe, and now they want to marry each other. The purpose is self-evident. It seems that even as powerful as the Wanyan tribe, under such circumstances, there are some can't sit still. We don't know their purpose yet, so we can't talk about countermeasures. Tang Ning thought for a while and said, let's just wait and see what happens. Letter to the palace. In the study, a person looked at King Xian and said, my lord, you must put your own safety first and stop fooling around. Today I almost King Xian waved his hand and said, "Okay, I will inform you if I want to go out next time." He walked to the desk, sat down, opened a brochure, and suddenly looked to another part of the room, asking, "The day after tomorrow, the court will hold a wedding banquet for Princess Chen and the envoy. Do you want to go with her?" Li Tianlan shook his head and said, "I'm not going." King Xian shook his head and said, "That's strange. Aren't you most concerned about the news about Chen Guo?" Without waiting for Li Tianlan to answer, he waved his hand and said, "If you don't want to go, just don't go. It's not interesting anyway. If there wasn't anyone in the royal family in the capital, I wouldn't bother to go." Li Tianlan walked out of the room, and soon someone hurried in, clasping his fists and saying, "Your Majesty, Prairie, the messenger from Prairie is here." "Oh," King Xian put down the book, his casual temperament changed, he tapped the table with his index finger and said, "Is Wani Umbu finally unable to sit still?" "Prince's mansion." The Prince of Chu looked ugly and asked, "Are they serious about not being friends with each other?" Prince Zhanshi nodded and said, "Your Highness, according to the Chen state's wedding envoy, the man who beat the prince has been sent back. This must be just an excuse for them to deal with us. This person simply does not take your Highness seriously inside." Snapped. The Prince of Chu state slapped his palm on the table and said gloomily, "They thought this was their Chen state." Prince Zhanshi raised his head and asked, "Your Highness, they are envoys after all. If there is any action in the East Palace, the imperial court may not be able to pass." "What's wrong with the envoy?" The Prince of Chu clenched his fists and said angrily, "I am the prince and the future emperor. Who of those old people think that I am the prince or the heir apparent? In their eyes, I am the prince, not as important as Chen Guo's envoy." As soon as he finished speaking, someone came forward to report, "The envoy from the Wanyan department wants to see you." The Crown Prince of Chu frowned and asked, "Wanyan department?" A man came forward and said, "Your Highness, the grassland people have sent an envoy to visit, and they have arrived in the capital today." The Prince of Chu looked outside and asked, "What are they doing in the prince's mansion?" Prince Zhanshi took a step forward and said, "Your Highness, you might as well let them in and ask them." After a while, several figures walked into the hall. A middle-aged woman at the front cupped her hands and said, "I have met His Highness the Crown Prince." The Crown Prince of Chu glanced at her and said, "There really is no one on the grassland, and they actually sent a woman out." The middle-aged woman looked up at him and said, "The grassland is barren. It is not as vast as Chu State. It has many talents. In addition to the benevolent emperor, there is also the wise and powerful King Xian, who is famous even in the most remote areas on the grassland. In the corner, you can often hear his name." The Crown Prince of Chu seemed to have been touched, with a look of fury on his face. He stared at the woman and said, "What did you say?" "You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 370. The Crown Prince of Chu stared at the middle-aged woman with an angry expression. For him, the word King of Faith has been a shadow that has accompanied him since he was a child. Although he is the prince of a country, above him, there is a more powerful regent. He believes in the wishes of the king and the people and has a mountain of prestige in the court. He has lost count of how many times he has woken up from a dream, just because of the dream. Here comes the man. He is only one step away from the throne, but if he wants to take this small step, he has to cross this mountain range. We know what His Highness the Crown Prince is worried about." The middle-aged woman looked up at him and said, "Perhaps, we can help the Crown Prince a little." The Prince of Chu calmed down, looked at her, and asked, "How can you help me?" The middle-aged woman said, "If there is no King Xian in Kyoto, His Highness the Crown Prince will be very happy, right?" The crown prince of Chu narrowed his eyes, looked at her, and asked, "What do you want me to do?" The middle-aged woman looked at him and said, "It's very simple, as long as your highness does us a small favor." The motive of the grassland coming to conquer Chu was questionable, but their purpose did not keep people guessing for long, and it became clear in less than half a day. Before many grassland envoys could settle down, they visited the senior officials of Chu state with great fanfare, including Prince Xian's palace, Prince's palace, Prime Minister's palace, and the 6 ministers' palaces. This kind of behavior that was open and closed and did not follow the rules shocked countless people's jaws. However, in recent years, there has been constant friction between grassland and the state of Chu. Neither country has ever sent an envoy. The first visit of an envoy from grassland is also of great significance to the state of Chu. If the two countries could negotiate peace and establish diplomatic relations, it would obviously be much better than the outbreak of war. The imperial court also paid special attention to these grassland envoys. It is precisely because of this that most of the houses they visited did not turn them away. In the splendid palace, Hirui hurriedly walked in and said, "Master Tang, we have figured out what those barbarians want to do. They want to marry the Chu state, and the one they want to marry is the princess of Changning. These barbarians actually snatched Let's Go first." Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "The terms they offered should be very generous, right?" Hirui raised his head and said in surprise, "How do you know, sir?" The Chen state and the Chu state were friends, and the grassland was an enemy. Almost everyone knew that the Chen state wanted to marry Princess Changning. How could the grassland people not be fully prepared if they wanted to interfere? Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "What price are they going to pay?" Hirui said, "I will give the Chu state 1,000 war horses every year, so that there will be no war with the Chu state for 10 years. The grassland people are good at riding and shooting, and their war horses are even more outstanding. No one can stop the cavalry when they pass by. This is also something that Chen and Chu are extremely envious of. If they give away thousands of well-trained war horses from Chu every year, in a few years, Chu state will be able to train a group of brave cavalry. As for no war within 10 years, this condition was equally tempting to the Chu courtiers. The Chu state is different from the Chen state. Although the Chen and Chu countries are now about the same national strength, the Chen state has maintained its current national strength for a long time and is still decreasing year by year. The Chu state is in a period of upward development. Years later, we still don't know how strong it will become. Of course, this does not rule out that they used a stratagem to break up the alliance between Chen and Chu. The Chu court was not that stupid, but no matter what, those people from the grassland had successfully divided this pool. The water is muddy. This also illustrates the truth from the side. If a woman wants to not worry about getting married, she still needs to improve herself. With strong martial arts skills, profound knowledge, good looks, and a good figure, there are so many people rushing to get. Tang Ning looked at Hirui and asked, "Did Prince Xian's mansion let the envoys from the Wanyan department in?" Hirui shook his head and said, "It is said that King Xian was not here and they did not go in." Tang Ning was stunned and asked, "King Xian isn't here?" Hirui nodded and said, "It is said that he went to the palace." Tang Ning walked outside the door and said, "Princess, if you want to find me, just tell me that I have something to do and I have to go out." Royal Palace. Ancient Temple. King Xian walked to the door with his hands behind his back and asked, "Is your majesty awake?" A eunuch bowed and said, "I just woke up for a while." King Xian nodded and walked into the palace. Emperor Chu leaned on the bed and said, "You are here. I heard that you were assassinated again today." King Xian waved his hand and said, "A few little frog thieves have been captured by others." Emperor Chu shook his head and said, "He is so shameless." "It's okay." King Xian walked to the window and sat down, asking, "Brother, how do you feel about your health today?" Emperor Chu did not answer this question. He paused for a moment and then asked again, the envoys from the state of Chen have arrived, and they are entertaining them. I heard from them that the state of Chen wants to marry Changning. What do you mean? King Xian shook his head and said, Zhao Zheng is quite capable, but his two sons are just useless idiots. Emperor Chu looked at him and asked, how does it compare to Zhi? King Xian thought for a moment and said, I'm still better than him. Emperor Chu lowered his head, paused again for a while, and then said, is there someone coming from the grassland? The person with ulterior motives is evil. King Xian helped him tuck the quilt and said, the Wanyan tribe has great ambitions. The Shuhu and Jiagu tribes were able to stop them for a while, but they will not be able to stop them forever. Sooner or later, there will be a battle. However, this let them stir things up for once, and it will help those short-sighted people in the court who want to harm the country to come out. It's not just the grasslands that have ambitions. The king of Chu looked into the empty space and said slowly, there are tigers and wolves lurking around. The world you and I have conquered is in Zhi's hands. Even if I die, I will not dare to close my eyes. After I leave, you have to help him keep an eye on the court. If you can help him, support him well. If he can't help him, then. He covered his mouth and coughed violently before he finished his words. Prince Xian gently patted his back and said, my brother, have a good rest and don't think about these things that hurt your heart. The guard at the door of Prince Xian's mansion looked at Tang Ning and said, my lord, my prince is not here. Please come back another day. Tang Ning bowed and said, then I'll take my leave. Inside the mansion, a delicate courtyard. A maid walked into the yard with a tray and said, Princess, this is the soup that the princess made for you. Li Tianlan sat at the table and said, put it aside for now. The maid stepped aside and reminded, the princess has told you to drink it while it's hot. Li Tianlan picked up the spoon, tasted it, and put it down. She took out a stick from her sleeve, which had an 8-character message on it, what night is it, I meet this good man. After she looked at it, she smiled self-deprecatingly and threw it aside. Self-deprecation is a mockery of her who has never believed in gods and Buddhas, but one day she would be disturbed by these empty things. If this message is true, then someone should appear in front of her now. She picked up the spoon again, her eyes suddenly flickered, and she looked up and looked forward. A light figure flew in from outside the wall and landed steadily. Tang Ning clapped his hands. The guards of Prince Xian's mansion were indeed very strict. There were guards patrolling at both gates of the mansion, and there was no interval between shift changes. He walked around the mansion and found only this weak defense. He looked around and planned to find a servant to ask where the princess lived. When he raised his head, he was suddenly startled. He climbed over the wall and found a small courtyard with a woman sitting at a stone table in the courtyard. The next moment, the woman's figure disappeared in front of Tang Ning. At the same time, he felt a breeze blowing in front of him. Tang Ning's face changed slightly, and he moved more than a foot to the left almost instantly, but the next moment, he felt a chill on his neck, and a cold long sword was placed on his neck. He could even feel the sharpness of the sword. Tang Ning tore off the black cloth on his face and asked, "What are you doing?" Clang! The long sword in the woman's hand fell to the ground. Warm reminder, if you find that clicking the next page will force you to jump to other websites, please use the chapter error or contact us at the bottom to inform us, we will handle it as soon as possible. Thank you for your understanding. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 371. Tang Ning sat at a table in the courtyard of the Prince Xian's mansion and asked, "What kind of soup is this? It tastes good." Li Tianlan sat opposite him, wiping the dusty sword with a white handkerchief, and said, "Lily bird's nest soup." After sheathing the sword, she looked up at Tang Ning and asked, "Why did you come to Chu?" Tang Ning finished drinking the lily bird's nest soup and said, I said I would come to see you if I had the chance. I happened to come here to escort the princess on a diplomatic mission this time. Li Tianlan looked at the courtyard wall and asked, why don't you go through the main gate? Tang Ning, he explained, I came here yesterday, but someone in your palace said you were away from home, so I had to climb over the wall to come in and take a look. Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows and asked, I've been in the palace the whole time. When did you go away? I don't know about that. Tang Ning shook his head and said, you should ask the guard at the door. Li Tianlan thought about it and didn't ask about it anymore. He said, let's go out for a walk. Although they haven't seen each other for a long time, it always feels strange to sit face to face and just chat without doing anything. It's better to talk while walking. Tang Ning nodded and said, I'll wait for you outside. He put down the bowl, wiped his mouth with the handkerchief handed by Li Tianlan, then put it in his arms and flew over the courtyard wall again. A figure walked in from outside the courtyard and asked, Lanlan, who are you talking to? Li Tianlan said, no one, just me. Strange, I just heard someone talking in the courtyard. Princess Xian said in surprise, looked at the empty bowl on the table, and asked, is the lily bird's nest soup today okay? Li Tianlan nodded and said, not bad. She looked at Princess Xian and said, Mother, I'm going out for a while. Go. Princess Xian nodded and said, I'll go out with you. Mother, go first, I need to change clothes, she said hesitantly, and then walked into the room. After a while, Princess Xian looked at her, who had changed into a long dress and walked out of the room, with a look of surprise on her face. Because of her martial arts training, she usually wears tight clothes, and wears less clothes for girls. When Li Tianlan walked out of the courtyard gate, he turned back and said, Mother, next time you go to Puji Temple, remember to donate 1,000 taels of incense money for me. After she said that, she left quickly. Princess Xian was stunned. She never believed in gods and Buddhas. What kind of incense money was this? After a long time, Princess Xian turned around and looked at a maid behind her and asked, has the princess met anyone recently, or encountered anything? The maid shook her head and said blankly, I don't know. Tang Ning stood outside the wall of Prince Xian's mansion, waiting for her to fly out of the wall. After waiting for a long time, she was wondering why she took so long when a voice came from behind. Let's go. Li Tianlan stood a few steps behind him and said, I'll take you to a place. Tang Ning's eyes stayed on her for a while. He was used to her neutral dress, and it was a bit uncomfortable to see her wearing women's clothes. The night had begun to spread, and the two walked on the street, with lights in front and behind them. Li Tianlan raised his head, looked at the sparse crowd under the night sky, and suddenly asked, how do you know my identity? Tang Ning said, what is there to guess? There may be many Li Tianlans, but there is only one Princess Chang Ning who is both civil and military. A princess is a princess, what's so great about it? You were hiding it before. Li Tianlan shook his head and said, at that time, I thought we would never see each other again. Maybe this is fate. Tang Ning looked around and asked, where are you taking me? We're here. Li Tianlan walked into a small shop on the street. Tang Ning followed her in and found that it was a noodle shop. Although the place was small and there were only a few tables and chairs, it was tidy and clean. There were no customers in the shop at the moment. Li Tianlan sat down at a table and said, Granny, give me 2 bowls of noodles. The princess is here. The shop was divided into 2 parts, the kitchen inside and the shop outside. An old woman came out and looked at Tang Ning with a surprised look before saying, Princess, please sit down for a while. The noodles will be ready soon. Li Tianlan said, Granny's noodle shop has been open for 20 years. I used to eat noodles here when I was a child. She looked at Tang Ning and explained, Granny's noodles are a specialty in Kyoto, but not many people know about it. You will know when you try it. After not seeing each other for a year, the first thing she did when they met again was to invite him to eat noodles. Could this have some special meaning in Chu? After a while, the old woman brought out 2 bowls of hot noodles and said with a smile, "The princess hasn't been here for a long time." At this time, several figures walked in from outside the door, sat down at the door, and said, "Grandma, give me 3 bowls of vegetable noodles, put more vegetables, more noodles, and more chopped green onions." The old woman walked over and said, "Let's go, we're closed today. Come back tomorrow if you want to eat." The man was surprised and said, "It's closed so early today, isn't there still more than an hour?" The old woman pulled them up from the chair and said impatiently, "The old woman said it was closed, so it was closed, stop talking nonsense, hurry up and go." After driving away several guests, she sat at the door and said with a smile, "Princess, eat slowly. I'll watch here and make sure they don't disturb you." I didn't expect that the princess would have the special treatment of clearing the place at this old lady's place selling noodles. Tang Ning first drank a mouthful of soup with a spoon, and her mouth was full of freshness. The noodles were moderately soft and hard, and very elastic. To make noodles with this taste, the kneading method and the control of the heat are extremely high. No wonder she has been thinking about this little shop since she was a child. Li Tianlan ate the noodles slowly and asked, "Not bad?" Tang Ning nodded and said, "This is the most delicious vegetarian noodles I have ever eaten." Li Tianlan did not continue the topic. He looked up at him and asked, "This time, you came here not only to send the bride, but also to propose marriage. Are you here to propose marriage for Prince Kong or Prince Duan?" Cough. Tang Ning covered her mouth and almost choked on a mouthful of soup. He took out a handkerchief and wiped his mouth, saying, "I don't agree with this matter." Li Tianlan looked at him and asked, "The marriage between the 2 countries is a major event that is beneficial to the stability of diplomatic relations. Why don't you agree? What kind of character are Prince Kong and Prince Duan?" "Don't you know?" Tang Ning looked at her and said sincerely, "With our relationship, can I watch you jump into the fire pit?" Li Tianlan put down his chopsticks, looked at him and asked, "What is our relationship?" Tang Ning thought about it, looked at her and asked, "At least we have lived and died together, so we can be regarded as friends of life and death, right?" Li Tianlan looked at him, picked up the chopsticks again, and said, "It seems that many things have happened to you since I left. Tell me, how did you become a doctor in the Ministry of Rights, and how did you become a wedding envoy?" In the year since she left, too many things happened, and it's a long story. Kyoto has a strict curfew. Tang Ning had only said less than half of her words when the street cleaning drum sounded. The 2 walked out of the noodle shop. Tang Ning looked at her and said, "It's late today. Let's talk about it another day." Li Tianlan looked up and asked, "Which day?" Tang Ning thought for a while and asked, "How about tomorrow?" Li Tianlan nodded, "Okay." Prince Xian's mansion. Li Tianlan walked into a hall. Prince Xian looked up at her and asked, "Why are you back so late? Come and have dinner." Li Tianlan walked forward and said, "Father and mother, please eat. I've eaten outside." She thought for a while and said, "By the way, I'll accompany father to the wedding banquet the day after tomorrow." Prince Xian's expression changed, and he immediately shook his head and said, "No, don't force yourself if you don't want to go. I'm by your side, and I can guarantee father's safety." Li Tianlan looked at him and said, "If it's like today again, and father encounters an assassin when he's alone, it's not good." Princess Xian's face changed, asked, "What, the prince encountered an assassin again today? Where are the guards? Why is the prince alone?" Prince Xian glanced at Li Tianlan obscurely, and then hurriedly explained, "Just a few small thieves, it's no problem." Princess Xian looked at him and said, "If you want to go somewhere in the future, even if you don't bring guards, you must let Lanlan follow." Prince Xian looked at her and said helplessly, I know. After comforting the princess for a while, he looked outside and asked, do you feel that Lanlan is a little different today? Princess Xian was surprised, does the prince feel the same way?